Now that the pivot table has been generated that we're going to use to calculate all the sums of squares, the first thing we will need to do is to copy that pivot table, and I'm copying it by highlighting an area larger than the pivot table so that I can simply go to copy and then paste special and again values and OK. And that's to get rid of the pivot table itself so that I simply have a table of numbers I can work with. The next step will be to put in the format for the sums of squares which we're going to actually calculate. And as shown in figure 10.10, there will be a sums of squares between people, a sums of squares within people, and the sums of squares within people will be divided up into sums of squares due to admissions, sums of squares residual, which cannot be accounted for by admissions, and following the figure, sums of squares total. Those values will go in the cells of row F. So to begin, we will calculate first the sums of squares total, which we will calculate in this column, and I will add another column as a place to put the sums of squares total. And as always, the sums of squares total is the squared difference between each observation and the grand mean. So that's the squared difference between this value, for example, and the grand mean, which is shown here on our pivot table. So I'll begin with the first one as equal, and I'll click on C2 minus, and I'll go over and get the grand mean, and again I'll fix that with an F4 so that I will always be working in the same cell. Square that and hit enter. And this is formatted as dollars. I'm going to reformat it as simply a number with no separators. That makes it a little easier to deal with. Then I'm going to double right click the lower left hand corner of that cell, and this is the column that will give us the total sums of squares, which we will put right here, and that will be equal to the sum of this column, and this is done with Control-Shift down arrow. And if we look at the result when I hit enter, this is the total sums of squares for this data set.